Hello, truth lovers. This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. In today's video, we're going to be discussing ancient India and Hinduism. So we're going to be looking at the ancient history, even the prehistory of the Indian subcontinent, and we're also going to be looking at the religion of Hinduism, which is one of the oldest religions in the world. So today we're going to be covering a lot of really excellent and exciting topics, including the so-called gods dwelling amongst humanity and sharing their knowledge amongst men. We're going to be talking about ancient advanced technology, including the flying machines called the Vimanas that are found in the Vedic texts. We're going to be talking about battles that were waged between these so-called gods and their children, the demigods. We're in that advanced tech, and we're going to be talking about other exciting topics, including ancient underwater cities and things that would even point back to the Genesis narrative of the pre-flood world found in the Christian scriptures. So the study of ancient Indian history, archaeology, and mythology provides so much information that supports the biblical narrative of the pre-flood world, the advanced global or worldwide civilization that existed there. It supports the narrative of the fallen angels called the Watchers coming down, cohabiting with human women, creating children that would have been considered in their time demigods by normal human beings, and the many other truths. These truths that we find in the book of Genesis or in extra biblical texts such as the book of Enoch, we see when we look at the history of India, we find in their ancient history and mythology stories that very much line up with this narrative. So as we're going to be talking about these things today, this video is going to assume that you have at least some basic knowledge of the truths of the pre-flood world. And if you do not have a basic understanding of those things, I would encourage you to go back and watch my video on the pre-flood world, where I really laid out a pretty in-depth introduction to those topics. So that will give you a good basis for moving forward with this video. But moving forward here, we see that India is an ancient land with a long and complicated history. And although India is a land of many different faiths and many different religions, we see that Hinduism today is the predominant faith in India. Most people, when they think of the nation of India today, they instinctively think of the religion of Hinduism and many of its commonly held beliefs, things such as reincarnation and these concepts of dharma or karma. These are the things that people think of when they think of India, even though there are many Muslims and Buddhists and Jain and other faiths in India. People think of Hinduism as much as anything else, especially in the Western world. And we see that in India, Hinduism is one of the oldest religions in the world. It stretches back thousands of years. It's a religion that's really as much as 5,000 years old. It really dates back to even the period of 3000 BC, really the origins of this faith. And it is a very diverse faith. It's composed of many subsects and groups. And this is illustrated from a statement that was made by the Supreme Court of India, which said, unlike other religions in the world, the Hindu religion does not claim any one prophet. It does not worship any one god. It does not believe in any one philosophic concept. It does not follow any one act of religious rites or performances. In fact, it does not satisfy the traditional features of a religion or creed. It is a way of life and nothing more. So we see in that statement that there is a great amount of diversity in beliefs in what we call the religion of Hinduism. And there are many different subsects, sects, groups, denominations, quote unquote, that we find within the religion of Hinduism. And even the simple question of whether Hindus worship one god or many different gods is more complicated than one may think. In one sense, Hinduism is certainly a polytheistic faith. India has rightly been called the land of a million gods, and you see within Hinduism that there are many gods such as Brahma or Vishnu or Shiva or many other examples that could be given. So it's certainly in that sense polytheistic, but in another sense, the question is more complicated because there are certain groups of Hindus that will only worship Shiva exclusively or Vishnu exclusively. There are cults that are dedicated to the exclusive worship of one of their gods exclusively. So you cannot say that all Hindus worship multiple gods. But make no mistake, we must understand that from the biblical Christian worldview, that Hinduism is a non-biblical faith. It is what we would call a pagan faith. It is a faith that is polytheistic and pagan, and it does commit what the Bible would define as idolatry. Therefore, Christians need to be sharing the truths of the gospel in Jesus Christ to their Hindu neighbors, that they need to speak the truth in love to them in this way by showing them the truth that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But the goal of this video is really to examine the history and mythology behind ancient India in Hinduism, because it really allows us to glean so much information about the ancient history of our world, that we see things that really support what the scriptures say about this advanced civilization in the pre-flood world. And we find these examples, and not only in looking at the Indian subcontinent, but in places like Mesopotamia or Egypt or the Americas, in places like Peru, or in other places all across the world. We find evidence for this historical narrative of the pre-flood world that we find in the Bible and in other texts such as the Book of Enoch. Now, as was previously stated, the Hindu religion and the Hindu worldview is one that incorporates multiple gods, and there's really too many for us to list in this video. But the three greatest gods found within the Hindu religion are Brahma, the creator god, Vishnu, the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. And these three gods compose what is called the Trimurti, or the Hindu Trinity. And these are the three gods that really are the most prominent within the Hindu religion and the Hindu historical worldview found in their sacred scriptures. The oldest and most sacred scriptures of Hinduism are what are called the Vedas. And the Vedas were written as early as 1500 BC, and the content that was written down in these ancient Hindu texts may be even older and go back to an even earlier date than that. Now, the Vedas were written in primeval or ancient Sanskrit. And Sanskrit in and of itself is a language that is fascinating. Today, Sanskrit is a dead language. It's still learned by some in India, such as the Brahmin class, who learn Sanskrit in order to read their sacred scriptures. But the language is no longer commonly spoken today, but it is the father language of a huge number of languages that are still spoken in the Indian subcontinent. Now, Sanskrit is fascinating because it is a part of what is called the Indo-European family of languages. And what is especially fascinating about the Sanskrit language is that its words, grammar, and syntax are remarkably similar to other ancient languages found in other parts of the world, such as Greek and Latin. This fact was originally discovered by a British scholar named William Jones, who lived in India during the 18th century, and he was the founder of what was called the Asiatic Society. Now, Jones, when he looked at certain Sanskrit words, he found that they were similar, if not almost identical, to the same words found in Greek and Latin. And this discovery, although it took time for it to be verified, ended up really changing not only the history of India, but it changed the entire history of languages as a whole. It really took this notion of languages and it really turned it on its head. And what's fascinating about this is that this agrees with the biblical view of language. If you believe the biblical narrative that after the great flood of Noah, that humanity was united at the Tower of Babel speaking one language, and then God separated the nations and he divided their tongue so that they all spoke a number of different languages. If you believe this history that's found in the book of Genesis, by inclination you're going to believe that all of the languages of the world are going to stem back to a common source. So when we see that languages that are separated by a great deal of distance, Greek and Latin found that were spoken in Europe and Sanskrit that is spoken in India, when we see that they are a part of the same family of languages and that they all come from a common origin. This really does line up with a biblical view of history and a biblical view of the world. So this in and of itself is extremely fascinating. When we come to the actual content of the Vedic text, the Hindu epics, as they are called, the ancient Sanskrit Vedic texts, we find that their content is even more epic than what we can even discern from its simple language that it is written in, called Sanskrit. We see that the content of the Vedas, it describes notions of the gods, quote unquote, dwelling amongst humanity, and that they have children that are demigods. We see these wars that are fought between these gods, including even high-tech technology such as these flying machines called vimanas. We see stories that line up with the biblical narrative, such as the story in Indian mythology of a great flood, and how there is a man called Manu who survives the flood because of the kindness that he showed to a fish, which was in actuality the incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu. And we find so much more content that really is mind-blowing when you really get into it. Now, it has to be understood that even though we would consider the content of the Vedic texts as a modern audience, we would consider them to be mythology, that to the Hindus and to the people who wrote them, that this is considered to be history. They believe that these texts have a literal historicity that cannot be denied, and that is something that is very important for us to understand, that modern people today who are part of the Hindu worldview would believe that. But even more important is that the actual authors of these texts were writing it as history, and that is what is most important. If we want to understand these texts, we need to understand the intent of the authors who wrote them. But in the Hindu epics found in the Vedic text, there are these two main texts that lay out these Hindu epics, such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And in these epics, these Hindu epics, we find stories of a time when the gods did dwell amongst humanity. And there are a number of examples we could give of this. One is the god Rama, who was considered the seventh avatar of Vishnu, dwelling amongst humanity and taking a wife and having children that would be considered demigods. I think the most famous example of all would be in the life of Lord Krishna. Now, Lord Krishna was believed to be the eighth avatar of Vishnu, and we find the story of his life in the Hindu epics, in the Hindu text, and that he was believed to have lived thousands of years ago. Certain texts even would state as early back of 3000 BC, if not earlier, and that it was believed that Lord Krishna lived for 125 years, and that he dwelled for much of his life in the holy city of Dwarka. And then when we read the story of his life, there's many deeds and exploits that Lord Krishna did. But one of the things we find predominantly is that he fought in what is called the Kurukshetra War, otherwise called the Mahabharata War. And in the Mahabharata War, we read of these two great families of the gods and the demigods that fight against each other, and that they employ advanced technology in these wars called the vimanas, or these flying machines. And when you read the ancient Sanskrit text, you see that these vimanas, these flying machines, are depicted. They look pyramidal in the sense that they are wider on the bottom, they are narrower on the top. They kind of look like Sumerian ziggurats, or they look like pyramids. And when you look at even the architecture of Hindu temples today, they are intentionally made in a way where they are supposed to mimic the vimanas, which have been called the carts of the gods, the flying machines of the gods. And what's even more amazing is that these Hindu texts, they describe how these vimanas fight against each other. They try to shoot each other down, and they employ powerful projectiles that we would almost describe as laser beams or missiles or things that we would only could describe in terms of modern technology. And that these Vimanas are found not just in one of the Vedic texts, but they are mentioned multiple times in the Vedic text. And this is really amazing. Now, how should we understand all this from a biblical worldview? Now, when you read the book of Genesis and you read the history of the pre-flood world, you find this history of what are called the Watchers, or the fallen angels. They descend down to the earth from heaven and they take for themselves human wives. And we find this corroborated in extra biblical texts such as the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch goes into far more detail than even the book of Genesis does. And we need to understand that the Bible itself quotes the book of Enoch in places such as the Epistle of Jude. And that the biblical authors, even Jesus and the apostles, they were aware of the book of Enoch and they had read it for themselves. And that the book of Enoch has been found even in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we know that in first century Judea, that it was something that all of the religious sects of Israel were reading and they had a knowledge of. And in the early church, the church fathers all were aware of the content of the book of Enoch and they believed it. And when you read the book of Genesis and the book of Enoch, you read the Bible and you read the book of Enoch, you read that this historical narrative of these what we would call the lowercase g gods, these angels. They come down, they take for themselves wives of humanity, and they share their knowledge amongst humanity. This is recorded especially in the book of Enoch, where it says that they taught them how to things such as agriculture or writing, or to mine precious metals, or what we would call to be witchcraft or magic, pharmakia. All of these things are described from the biblical narrative, that we see that this is the time when the quote gods dwelled amongst men, and that their children, which the Bible calls correctly as giants, we could describe as the demigods. And so when we read the Hindu Vedic text, the epics, and we read of these stories, we can see how this same history is being depicted in what we would call mythology. We see that the mythology is coming from a common historical source, and the inspired Christian scriptures are describing the same narrative. So this gives us a huge amount of insight into the ancient history of our world, and we see that the history of the Indian subcontinent is corroborating the exact same history that is recorded across the world, even in other civilizations such as Egypt, where this was called, this time when the gods dwelled amongst men, it's called Zep Tepi, the first time. The time when the gods shared their knowledge with humanity, starting human civilization. And we find the same type of history in the Americas in places such as the Mayan civilization, or the Inca civilization, or the Aztecs, or we see it found in the stories of the Native American tribes that are found across North America. And we see this history found all across the world, and we see that the Hindu epics are describing this very epic and insane history that really does, even though we would call it mythology, it stems from a common historical source. In the Hindu epics, in the mythology of Hinduism, we find more stories that corroborate with the biblical narrative of history that's found in the book of Genesis. And the most famous example of this would be that the Hindus have their own version of the flood story. And we find depictions of a great flood in the ancient histories and mythologies of civilizations all across the world, in the Americas, across Asia, places like China and India, in Europe, in the Middle East, Mesopotamia. All of these people have a flood story because of the fact that all of these people know that there was a great flood. This is literal history. And for the Hindus, they have this story of this man named Manu. And Manu shows kindness to this fish, who happens to not be a simple fish, but he is in fact an incarnation of the god Vishnu. And because of the kindness that he showed to this fish, that he is allowed to have prior warning of the great flood that is coming. And he ends up being the last man alive after this great catastrophe, this great flood wipes out humanity. And then after some time, because of rituals and devotion that he shows to the gods, he is given a woman who is it allows Manu to and his wife to repopulate the earth, that humanity is allowed to replenish the earth. Now, it needs to be understood that there are, of course, multiple versions of this story, but that it is well known in the ancient India and Hindu worldview. And this is fascinating because we see that this man named Manu, that he has similarities to Noah and the depiction of the Great Flood in the Bible. We see that it is similar to other depictions of the Great Flood, that even the flood is talked about in the Epic of Gilgamesh that's found in ancient Samaria. And we see that this evidence of a great flood is found in India just as it's found all across the world. And this is especially fascinating when we see that when you study the ancient history and the archaeology of the Indian subcontinent, you see that there is abundant evidence, even in addition to the story of Manu, of a great flood in the Indian subcontinent and in its surrounding oceans, including ancient underwater cities. Earlier I mentioned the city of Dwarka. There is a modern day Dwarka, but this is not the ancient city that is talked about in the ancient Vedic text. That this city was believed to have been lost and that it is now underwater. And that in Dwarka, in the Arabian Sea, that there is believed that there is an ancient underwater city in this part of the world off the coast of the Indian subcontinent. And in another place in South India, in a city called Mahabalipuram, there is, in the oceans off of that city, there are underwater temples and even an entire underwater city. The researcher Graham Hancock has personally done scuba diving, and he's done research, and that he's seen these ruins with his own eyes. Graham Hancock is famous for writing his book called Fingerprints of the Gods, and he's done a lot of research into the concept of an ancient civilization that's thousands of years old, that was a worldwide civilization, that it wasn't regional, but that it stemmed across the entire face of the earth. And when you understand it in places like Dwarka or Mahabalipuram or in other parts of the world, that there are these underwater temples and these underwater cities that are thousands of years old, that would appear to give further corroboration of what the Hindu mythology is saying, that there was a great flood and that there were cities and civilizations that existed before they were put beneath the waves. And we see that this is really fascinating because this ancient mythology, this Hindu mythology, it all does make sense, because when we look at the earliest known history we have of the Indian civilization in the archaeological records, we see that it does seem to corroborate this idea of a great flood. And the reason why I say this is because we see that this civilization, based on what we have of the archaeological record, it seems to have arose in the days that would have followed that very said great flood, what the scriptures call the Great Flood of Noah. The earliest archaeological record we have of civilization in the Indian subcontinent is what we call the Indus Valley civilization, or what has been called the Harappan civilization. And we have these ancient cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. And that these cities, these ancient cities, were vibrant, and they had tens of thousands of people living within them. That these cities were originally discovered in the 1920s by British archaeologists, and that we know that because of what we've discovered in modern-day Pakistan, that these were vibrant cities, that these were bustling cities, and that they date back to around between 3000 and 2600 BC, and that would be the exact same time period when other civilizations across the world, such as ancient Samaria, were also taking off. It would appear that this is when civilization was beginning to re-emerge following events such as the Great Flood and the separation of the peoples of the world after the Tower of Babel. And that the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, it goes back to as early as 3000 BC, and that it really hit its mark between 2600 BC and 1800 BC. And around 1800 BC is when the Harappan civilization began its period of decline, and the peoples of the Indian subcontinent gradually migrated east to the Ganges River area, and that is where we find the rise of modern day Hinduism. The Vedic texts that I've been talking about were really written in the post-Harappan period. Like I said, the decline of Harappa really goes back to around 1800 BC, according to the beliefs of modern day archaeologists. And the Vedic texts were written as early as 1500 BC. Really, in the period between 1500 BC and 1000 BC is when the Rig Veda was believed to have been written. And the Brahmanas were believed to have been written somewhat later, between 900 and 700 BC. So really, in that period of history, what has been called the Vedic period, we see the writing of the ancient Sanskrit texts, and we see also the origins of the religion that we now know to be Hinduism. That's really when these things really begin to come into their full-fledged form. And this is fascinating because the origins of Hinduism is even 1,000 years older than the next great religion that really entered the Indian subcontinent, which is Buddhism, because the life of the Buddha is commonly believed to have been in the 6th century BC, and Buddhism was a major religion that swept across India and across Asia following the life of the Buddha. And Hinduism for a time went into decline, but it really found a revival in the Iron Age. Really, between 300 AD and 600 AD, we see a revival of Hinduism in India, and that really goes through the Middle Ages, that there is a great revival of Hinduism. And Hinduism has continued on all throughout the history of India, even in the midst of things such as the Muslim invasions that start in the 13th century, or the process of British colonization that took place in the 18th and 19th centuries. And even in modern day independent democratic India, we still see a grip of Hinduism. So the entire history of India, it is once again a very interesting, complex history. But really the main thing that we can glean from all of this ancient history, archaeology, mythology, is that India is another example of what is seen in civilizations across the world, that common history that's found in the Bible is corroborated by civilizations and ancient texts all over the world, and that we do see evidence of a great flood. We see evidence of a great civilization that existed prior to that said great flood, and that we do see a time when what the Bible calls these angels, that they did descend to the earth and dwell amongst humanity. And once you understand that history, you can understand the entire history of the world that you simply cannot understand in the same way if you do not have that foundation for the beginnings and origins of history. And there's really no better place to start in understanding that history than the book of Genesis. The inspired scriptures of the true and living God, what's found in the Bible, gives us the foundation for understanding the entire progression of history. And what we see in the ancient Vedic text of Hinduism and the ancient archaeology of the Indian subcontinent corroborates that very same history, and those fascinating connections are made. So as I always say, guys, India and Hinduism, if you discern them rightly from a biblical worldview, they're fascinating topics, things that are worth looking into. They're fascinating. And even the ancient history and archaeology of all of the ancient civilizations of the world are fascinating, and they're things that can strengthen your faith if you study them from a biblical worldview. So all that being said, guys, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truth Ministries. God bless.
If you've enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.